there were huge financial implications here. It was an extraneous event, a little bit like the pandemic in some ways, that is not an economic thing in itself, but with just enormous ramifications. And what I remember so vividly that day was the void of uncertainty that everybody was staring into. I mean, as you say, the stock market was closed. I mean, one of the great hallmarks of the U.S. markets is they're liquid. If you need your money, you can get them. There will be a price that you could get it, and that was shut down. Then, nobody knew, was this the beginning of a wave of attacks, or was this it? Where was this going next? It was a level of panic and fear that, to this day, I've never experienced again, and I hope we never do.
Yeah, we all certainly hope we never do. But it is interesting. I mean, these last 20 years have not been without a great deal of tumult, obviously, beginning with 9/11, and then we had a financial crisis 8 years later. And then 12 years later, we have a pandemic, Jim. I mean, it has been sort of one thing after another. It's interesting, of course, the unifying thing there. Perhaps the Fed has always been there, hasn't it, to at least give the market its all.
Yeah, and I think the Fed has learned a lot through these experiences, including reactions to September 11th and the importance, again, of liquidity, which the Fed can, play a major role in doing. But one thing that has struck me over all these years, going back to then and even before, is the collective wisdom of investors is very powerful. And eventually, no matter what the emotional level of fear and panic, the facts reassert themselves. The markets are, over the longer term, very rational, very focused on what matters, which is economic activity and then ultimately earnings in the stock market. So it's very clear to me, looking back, the market takes a very long view. I mean, there was tremendous panic when the market finally reopened. I think it was after 6 days of being closed. And, people were terrified about what was going to happen, with the bottom totally drop out. And it was a historic plunge, but it didn't collapse completely. Their buyers did step in, and fairly soon, really, the market recovered those losses back in 2001. Now, it went onto a steep decline in 2002, but that was in the context of the tech bubble having burst in 2000, not really anything to do with the terrorist attacks. So I think, one thing I certainly learned as an investor is, don't try to trade on these, panicky, fear-inducing, emotion-driven moments, but step back, take a deep breath, and wait, because reason eventually reasserts itself.
I think it's easy sometimes to refer to the markets or Wall Street as almost these amorphous things, when really they're comprised of people, right? And the fact that you wrote this book, this incredible book, Heart of a Soldier, which recounts some of those people and specifically the life of a man who basically dedicated his life in those final moments to saving others here on Wall Street. Just 20 years later, if you could just share a little bit of that story and some of those people that you've encountered in the process.
Yeah, well, this was the story of Rick Rescorla, he gave his own life saving others that day. And it was so clear that the book really goes through his whole life. That was his destiny. He was put on this earth to fulfill that mission, in my view. And I only found out about him because, that day I started doing some reporting, and, again, the losses were just horrible. It was like nothing but loss and tragedy and sadness. And that day I did notice that, I was looking at the losses from the various firms down there, and Morgan Stanley really stood out. They were the largest employer in the World Trade Center. They had over 3,000 employees, and they only had 6 fatalities. And companies above them had way more, and companies below them had way more. So it kind of just stuck in my head. It's like the dog that doesn't bark. It wasn't the main story, but I was puzzled and intrigued by that. And I thought, oh, my God, could this be a glimmer of good news? And interestingly, I was talking about this to CNBC's own Jim Cramer, and he said, I think there was some guy in charge of security there. And that, I started looking more into it, and that's how I finally found out about Rick Rescorla, and the more I learned, the more incredible the story seemed. He was out of the center that day, had gotten everybody out, and that in of itself is a pretty amazing story. But then there were 6 people still missing, and his sense of duty was so strong that he went back up into the tower to save those people who had, stubbornly refused to come out. And in doing that, he gave his own life. So, to me, there was good news that came out of this too. I think that's true in any tragedy. People behave and react in different ways, but for some people, the best in their nature emerges when the times are the worst. And that's what I found so inspiring about that story.